All right, well, if everybody's here, you can take a seat. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Script Junkie, also go by Matt Weeks, so that's fine too. Script Junkie's a little easier to remember, and also my website. Also, if you Google Matt Weeks, you'll get this guy who was accused of killing his fiance and got like lynched mobbed like a few years. It's really weird, but anyway, we're going to be talking about Ambush. So first of all, a little bit about who I am. If you're not familiar with me, which is fine, you're probably not. I've done a little bit of a research releasing different pieces of research in the past couple of years, primarily with Metasploit. I'm a Metasploit developer with a community, so I've written stuff like client-side privilege escalation exploits, payloads encoding, shellcode, servers, code injection, post-exploit stuff, and the back-end stuff like the remote procedure call interface and the GUI. RPC is also the back-end for Armitage and Cobalt Strike, that kind of thing. Day job is malware reverse engineer, but everything that I've really been releasing, doing presentations on, releasing publicly has generally been offensive focused, and so it's been really interesting because this is a big departure for me because prior to this point, I've tended to release, I put stuff out on my blog that I find or commit to Metasploit or whatever. And so I've done attacks against crypto algorithms, attacks against tool to attack like Facebook and other web logins, various generic Windows attacks. Turned around, did an exploit against Metasploit itself. Did exploit against Firefox and McAfee. Also attacks against Intel, which I presented last year, and then against Microsoft Office again. And so after all of this stuff, what really struck me and kind of triggered this whole work was somebody said, okay, so there's all these attacks out there. You can do all this exploit stuff. So if you could have anything that you wanted to defend a network, what would it be? And so that was kind of interesting. And I just thought about the different perceptions between offense and defense. So, well, why was I doing all this offensive stuff? Well, it was because, a lot of this kind of came out from learning about security in college or whatever, which was just a few years ago. And so, take a few years ago before I was, really even familiar with any of these concepts. And, hacking, of course, seems like magic. It's like, you get in, you're doing what nobody else knows what to do, and, it seems to be impossible. And if you come up with an exploit against a piece of software, you feel smarter than everybody who was behind that software. You feel smarter than the billions that Microsoft put into whatever, all that. And defense, well, defense is normal. Defense is boring, and so defense is more difficult. If you think about it, attackers have exceptional success. So if I'm pen testing a company, I try to get in, maybe something doesn't work. Maybe I try to get in again, try something else, that doesn't work, until eventually I try something and it works, and then yay, I win. I win everything. Whereas your defense, you're trying, if you stop an attack, well, that's normal. You stop an attack, that's normal. And then, oh, something exceptional happens, oh, you got hacked, you lose. And so offense always sounds more exciting, defense always sounds more boring. And so I thought about the different perceptions between that and why I was doing offense. And I realized after a while that, it got to the point where I was thinking, no, offense isn't the amazing, wow, how did you do that? Because there are so many ways to go get in. What would be really amazing if you could come up with some actually good defensive technology to actually stop some of these attacks. And so I thought, well, I hear all these perceptions between offense and defense, and I can't help you with a lot of those if you think offense is more exciting. But one thing that I heard again and again and again, and so this is what I'm calling the myth, is just common frustration between defensive guys is this idea that attackers only need to win once. And so you hear this again and again. I set up all these defenses, all they got to do is find one hole in, and then man, I'm owned, and they win. And so I thought, that's not the case. Or actually, maybe more specifically, that is the case, but that really, really shouldn't be the case. And so I thought about, you should not have your defense set up in such a way. When people talk about this, what they're basically talking about is a defense which is based on this idea of the wall. So what is the wall? Well, the wall is, inside this little box, that's what anybody outside can do. And so here, for example, we can take the JDK security model. Inside that little box there is our sandbox. And outside remote attackers can do whatever they want inside the sandbox on the web page, but they better not be able to talk anything outside that little box, which is our files and our data and our processes and all that other good stuff. And so this is the wall, and we put our security measures in place. Even though they know everything about this, they shouldn't be able to break out. And yet, what happens? Well, every month, it's kind of like Patch Tuesday, except every month for Oracle, somebody releases a Java ODE, right? And so you get all these exploits which break through the wall. And so you think you've done everything to secure it, but somebody comes up with an exploit and gets through. Or, even without that, somebody just sends a link to your people, and they've got a nice link to a Java signed applet and says, just click this to see the web page. And sure enough, people allow them access because they're tricked to allowing access. So basically, attacks either come into exploit categories or allowed access categories, which was probably unintentional. And this happens all the time, and everybody always hacks everybody. And so on the defense, what can you do about this? Well, advice basically follows brush your teeth and floss, which is, of course, patch your systems and train the monkeys not to push the buttons. But guess what happens? Well, somebody's always got an exploit, or you haven't patched it, or something else, or all the monkeys keep clicking the buttons. And you can do phishing awareness. I heard statistics. I don't know if any of these statistics are worthwhile, but the best information, awareness campaign, you tell your people don't click on the buttons, and that, still 30% of the people click on the buttons. If you actually send them something like Phish Me, where they actually get phished, and then they click on it, and then they get punished for that or whatever, then it'll be better, and still now only 5% of your people will click on stuff that comes in. So, of course, the attackers still get in, and news, this will fail. So, what can you do outside of that whole paradigm, since that's not going to work / is not working? So you've got different points of defense that you should be defending against. And there should be, if you think about this, turn around, start thinking about it from an attacker's perspective. Let's say I'm going to do the cyber criminal. I'm going to go own as many people as I can, set up a botnet, steal their credit cards, and get rich quick scheme. So what points of defense are out there which could stop me? Well, so you can start with a ton of external points of defense. So in this case, if somebody sees what I'm doing and finds out that it's me that's doing it, that's a fail, because then I can get arrested by the FBI and share a cell with a large roommate, and that would be bad for me. So externally, in order to achieve this whole thing, what I'm going to do is first, let's say I'm going to get an exploit pack, put it on a website. So I've got, first of all, I've got to get a domain out there, which it goes back to. So obviously I can't just register a domain, except even in the process of registering the domain, I have to make sure that my IP address, my browser info, any of that doesn't get sent over there. And then I got to get a server. So how am I, well, in order to get either of those things, either I pay for them with a credit card. No, that's a really bad idea, because once again, I get caught. Or maybe I could use a prepaid credit card, except it's still maybe possible to trace that back to, security camera, who bought that credit card. And so maybe I could hack into somebody else's server, but then once again, there's all these opportunities to get caught. So that's just getting a server which I can host this from. Then I got to get the exploit pack, which itself could be, buying it from somebody who I don't know who that is. And then let's say I get this and I set it up, and then I have to get people to go to this. So then I've got to get traffic and Black Hat SEO or whatever I use to get traffic, and then I go pop all these people. And now what do I got to do? Well, now I got to go have malware, which is not going to get detected by the antivirus agencies. So that's not necessarily a chance to get caught, but it's more work that I have to go through. It's more hoops that I have to avoid, or I can get caught and it can get stopped again. And then it gets on the system, and I steal all your credit cards when you go buy something off Amazon, and then I take that, and then I have to cash out. But oh wait, if I go cash out and that's a stolen credit card, that's again another opportunity to get caught by law enforcement, whatever. And so maybe I could set up some type of shipping scheme with mules and whatever, but they could get caught, and that could still end up coming back to me. So there's so many extra. We haven't even talked about, you can probably come up with 15 different points here that I could get caught at. And we haven't even talked about anything that you can do yourself to secure your own stuff. And so Having said that, there is a great shortage of competent and willing FBI and whatever police agents to go prosecute all this and to go investigate all this. And so many of these layers, although they are potentially out there, often won't be followed down. So we go back to your network. Let's say you're running a company network, and so you've got network defense measures. So you've got your intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system. Well, those are nice and all, but most likely, since the network is the traditional location for an IDS, IPS, if I'm going to write malware, I'm going to guarantee that anything going over the network is highly obfuscated or encrypted, and you're not going to see this. It's not going to trigger one of your generic signatures. I'm not just going to send a command shell over plain text. So then we bring ourselves down to the host level. So what can you do at the host level? Well, you've got a couple different strategies. You can try to patch your systems. You can try to install security software. So for example, you've got antivirus. Well, antivirus is great. Antivirus stops all attacks. And nothing has ever gotten past antivirus before. So if you've got that, but just in case that fails, then what happens? Well, the problem is it fails because it's this one-size-fits-all mentality. So everybody has the same antivirus. Everybody can download McAfee and experiment with that. And what people need to realize when they're complaining that antivirus didn't catch attacks is, if I'm an attacker, I am never going to send you a piece of malware which I think is going to trigger your antivirus. I will keep modifying it until I am sure it's going to get past. So this is all stuff we've heard of. So we move farther to more behavior-based monitoring. Well, now this is a step up. Under this category, I would put host intrusion prevention systems. Well, now I can start to customize that and look for bad stuff which the antivirus companies didn't necessarily catch. And so this is pretty good if I take the effort to use it correctly, and yet it's still very limited. So most host intrusion prevention systems out there, actually all host intrusion prevention systems out there, have a set of places where they can watch. They can say, you can make a rule for one process can't touch this file, or something like that. And so a lot of activity which malware uses doesn't get caught. And so this is the main problem. Host intrusion prevention systems and antivirus systems and intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems, they all watch certain defined points. So for example, the IDS will watch the network. If I'm writing malware, I know that that point could be watched. I'm going to encrypt it, I'm going to obfuscate it, I'm going to do whatever. If I'm avoiding host intrusion prevention systems, I'm going to get a copy of that, which is really easy. Every security company out there has trial versions, or you can pirate a version or whatever. And then I'm going to see where it hooks in and what systems, what functions it's watching, what actions it can identify and prevent. And then I'm going to do this. This is actually a slide from a 2004 Black Hat presentation on bypassing host intrusion prevention systems. Really not much has changed since then. If a host intrusion prevention system, if you can't see this here is your program. This here is kernel32.dll. Most programs will call kernel32 to write a file or do any other normal system activity. There will be hooks there which will redirect that flow to the intrusion prevention system, which will say, is this allowed to do this? Yes, no. And so you can bypass that by simply bypassing the hook, recreating whatever instructions that it used, or calling a lower layer function like ntdll using native API, or even making direct syscalls into the kernel. And so you know this hook is at this spot, and so you can bypass it. Or you can use other techniques, such as you can make a file that you can touch and have it hard linked to a file that you can't touch. And the host intrusion prevention system will be dutifully confused, and you will get past it. Because you know what the point is ahead of time, you can spend all your time coming up with a way around it or a way to obfuscate or bypass whatever you're doing through it. And then you have all these characteristics. So as a malware reverser, I can see this sometimes. Malware does something which is common, but the host intrusion prevention system isn't watching anything at that point, so I can't identify that. I can't stop that activity. And so this is what you end up. You end up being the invisible guy in crisis, and no one will ever see you, and malware will work well, and bad guys win. So I decided, what we really need is a new approach to this. And this approach has to look kind of more like this than the wall. While we know that any particular protection at any particular point may be able to be bypassed, what we want to do is put up enough of them in a way that an intruder will not be able to easily bypass all of them. And this is based on two basic facts. And the first of all is evading point checks is hard. And so what do I mean by this? Well, yes, you can do something like bypass that hook, but it's going to take you a significant amount of effort to figure out how to do lower layer hooks or lower layer function calls or direct syscalls. Direct syscalls are really hard. Every version of Windows and sometimes Service Pack uses different syscalls for the same functions. Some of them add functions or remove functions. So if you want to try to make that work, it's very difficult to make a generic piece of malware work using just syscalls. And that is why most malware does not do this. As an example here, you could take a look at the Dooku malware, everybody's favorite son of Stuxnet or brother of Stuxnet or mother-in-law of Stuxnet. I don't know the malware taxonomy, but Dooku used a process injection technique. So prior to Dooku, all the public process injection techniques, very common in malware, you get a handle to another process. You can do that by creating a process or opening a process or debugging a process. And then you get memory in the other process. So you can either allocate new memory or maybe you can override existing memory. And then you write your code into the other process. And so that used the function write process memory or the equivalent NTDLL function, NT-write virtual memory. So it went through that point. And then after that point, you had to start your code. And so either you could hijack an existing thread, or you could use a new thread, or you could wait for code to get there anyway. And so there are different ways of all these steps, except for the part of writing your code into the remote process. That always used the same thing. So intrusion detection systems, host intrusion prevention systems watched that point. Well, Dooku used something called map view of section. It's another obscure native API to get their code into the remote process without going through this point check. And that was very unique, very surprising. It probably took a lot of effort to figure out how to do that, to evade the point check. But it was worth it because creating point checks is hard. And I don't want to waste too much time because I do want to do demos. So I won't go on the link, but I have a link. I'll put this up on my site, and you can follow that. As an example to prove that creating point checks is hard, I have here a link to an article on a forum discussing different host intrusion prevention systems. And so they were talking about DSA. I forget what that stands for, but that was just one of the lesser-known host intrusion prevention systems. And DSA included things like keylogger detection. So most keyloggers, in order to get your keystrokes, will use something called set Windows hook EX, which will set a hook into the keyboard, or they will use something called get async key state, which will rapidly poll for, is this key pressed down? Is this key pressed down? And it will loop that very fast again and again, and it will detect all your keystrokes. Well, somebody came up with a keylogger that used a different function called get key state. They called it Martin's undetectable keylogger because existing host intrusion prevention systems didn't monitor that function. That function was able to read the keyboard buffer. And all of a sudden, the forum poster asked, well, I can't detect these keyloggers, so what do I do about it? And the answer is, well, maybe you could get a new host intrusion prevention system, but that will probably have its own holes, and that'll be its own bucket of worms. Or maybe you could wait a couple years, and maybe they will add in the ability to monitor this new function on this host intrusion prevention system. Because creating point checks is hard. So what can we do in response to this? Well, not anymore. So Ambush is designed with this basic concept that you can write, Ambush is what I wrote, a host intrusion prevention system that I wrote. And you can write a signature to apply to any function of any exported DLL system-wide. And so the idea is now we are no longer limited to watching one particular function or another particular function. Because if you see something like, oh, get async key state, you can do a little bit of signature creation, and now you can monitor that function. You can block that function. What's also unique about this is instead of, say, monitoring read file, let's say malware has a bypass for that by calling the lower layer NTDLL function NT-read file. Well, now you can put a signature on NT-read file, and there's no way ahead of time that a malware author is going to know where those hooks are, where those signatures are. And you can be really creative in how you write these signatures and hooks and avoid any of this malware behavior which avoids these point checks. So this does come with a lot of technical difficulties, however. The first of all is this whole idea of hooking any arbitrary function and any arbitrary number of functions. I have to use a lot of dynamic code generation to try to make that happen. So for example, you look at the Komodo host intrusion prevention system. So Komodo will hook different functions on the system. For every function that it hooks, it has a function which handles the hook. So when your program jumps to that function which you're hooking, it will then redirect execution flow with a jump to the Komodo function. The Komodo function will inspect the arguments, decide if this is something that it needs to act on, and then if it decides to pass it, then it will jump back to the original function, execute that, and continue. Well, I have one single function which handles all the signatures, and I will jump from the function that I'm hooking eventually to this function. Well, this function isn't going to know which function was hooked. It isn't going to know what the signatures are ahead of time. It isn't going to know any of that. So I have to use a lot of dynamic code generation. And if I can make this work, which it's not working. Pull that up here. So this is basically what the function hooking code looks like. So starting with the program, it's going to make a call to an API function. At that point, I have to use a dynamically generated springboard to load up the configuration. So there's going to be one of these for every function that I hook, and that's going to take a pointer to the compiled signature and put that into one of the caller saved registers. So x86 and x64 each have registers which the calling function has to save, and the callee can override at will. So I use those temporarily to get the pointer, and then use that to jump to my main function, which is hook 0. That is the main compiled function which will read the signature, which will tell it what function that I hooked, what the arguments look like, what the restrictions on those arguments are. You can write a restriction that says, if this is a string argument and it matches this regular expression, then block it. Or if this is an integer argument and it matches this number or range or bit mask, then block it or kill the calling process or kill the calling thread, etc. And then if the signature decides to allow the function to pass, then it has to go back and call the inner API function. And so to do that, it has to use a trampoline. So the trampoline will re-execute any instructions that I overwrote to make this hook in the first place, and then execute the real API call, which will then return back into my function. And at that point, I can do post-call signatures. So you can write a signature, for example, that says, if you call winsock receive, and you just receive something from the network, and then after the call, the buffer contents look like MZ blah, 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 PE. So it looks like you're just downloading code from the internet, then throw an alert. And those signature, so you can do post-call signatures to look at advanced behavior using that kind of technique as well. At that point, then we need to return back to our original program. And then you run into a artificiality of Windows API calls. They use something called the standard call calling convention. x86 is painful because they have like 5 different calling conventions. But almost all the Windows API calls use the standard call calling convention. So I implemented standard call on x86. So in standard call, the called function has to clean up the stack. So once again, I have to know how many arguments were on the stack. And this is different for any of the functions which I can hook. So once again, I have to have dynamically generated code to fix up the stack and then return back to the program. This might seem like a lot of overhead, but in reality, although there are a lot of different cases, each one of these is just about 3 or 4 instructions to go get the pointer and jump. And I have not noticed a significant degradation in speed with this type of hooking. So now that we have that, we do run into a number of significant challenges. So before we go further, I want to talk a little bit about this. So first of all, we mentioned the calling conventions and code generation. Code generation is very difficult because of different assembly complexities. So if I'm hooking a function and it's a standard Windows API function that's exported in kernel and it's all documented, they normally have something called hot patch points. So the beginning of the function starts with a move EDI instruction, but you don't need to worry about. It does nothing, and it's 2 bytes, and then it continues with the body of the function. Before the function are 5 bytes of nops, or in Windows 8 they changed that to interrupts, but basically bytes that don't do anything. What you can do is overwrite the first 2 bytes of the function to be a jump back to the 5 bytes, and those 5 bytes can fit a long jump, which can take you to whatever code that you want. So it's very easy using those jump instructions to jump to your code and hook Windows API functions which have hot patch points. On x64, it uses a different technique where it uses a pointer. It says jump to whatever is at this address, and then you can swap out that pointer with your address instead of the real function address. But on native API functions, lower layer functions, other functions, this becomes a lot more difficult. Because what you have is you don't have nice hot patch points. So you're overriding actual opcodes of the function, actual instructions, with your jump to your function. So you've got to recreate those later, but those can be kind of complicated because those, for example, could be an if statement. If this, go here, else go there. So over here, when we jump back to our function, this trampoline, this can actually have multiple arrows out back to multiple places in the inner API function, as I have to recreate the jump and rehook up all the offsets to follow that branch or follow a jump. So that entails a lot of difficulties, and unfortunately there are some issues. So certain functions, I have run into a couple of them, do not obey standard rules of API calls. So they do not obey the caller saves this register. They assume the callee is not going to change that register. That's very rare, but it occasionally happens. Another thing that occasionally happens is if I am overriding actual instructions, there's a possibility that there could be a loop or a jump back to the middle of the instructions that I overwrote, which I maybe overwrote with one big jump instruction, and so that will cause a crash because it won't be following the path that I thought it would. So that's, again, uncommon, but it still happens. So what that means is there's a possibility that just setting a hook can cause a crash, which we'll see later. Other issues I ran into was dynamic loads, the concept of how do I get this loaded into every function system-wide, into every process. And so how I'm doing that is I'm hooking the create process calls so that a new process which is created will be created suspended, my code will be injected into it, and then it will resume after it's been all hooked up. DLLs can also be loaded dynamically, and so I hook a low-layer DLL load so that when a new DLL is loaded, then I can hook that up if I have signatures for that. And finally, Windows 8 made like 5 different changes which broke this. They changed how the hot patch points looked. They changed how some of the imports looked. They made a lot of other changes, but we have worked on compensating for that as well. So what's the bad news? Well, given these difficulties, there are certain operational challenges. So if you write a signature which blocks a function which is used by a core Windows API service, you can very easily turn your computer into a brick. In contrast with other host intrusion prevention systems, which will kind of handhold you and only let you touch certain things, the whole point of ambush is chains are gone. You can do whatever you want, and so you can very easily kill yourself. There's even a possibility that if you write a signature which doesn't do a block or a kill, that could still cause a crash. Like I said, it's not very common, but it could happen. If you do that and crash your system, then you're pretty much hosed. You have to reboot into safe mode and fix that, etc. So the concept of developing using these signatures, you do have to be careful. I would recommend testing them out in a VM before you use them. And the bigger problem is this idea of kernel hooking. So because of PatchGuard on 64-bit, which most systems are 64-bit now anyway, it is not easy to do a generic hook of Windows system calls. Microsoft tries to make that impossible. So I decided not to try to, so there are ways of trying to turn that off, but if you do that, then you're breaking what is being sold as a security measure in itself. There's always a possibility Microsoft could change their PatchGuard implementation and then blue screen everybody you install this on. And there's a lot of other big issues with kernel hooking. So there's the idea that you have to have signed code to load in the kernel. Well, I'm making this as an open source project, and so I'm not going to pay for a code signing cert, which now all of a sudden only I'm the guy who can make this open source project. So there's a lot of difficulties with that, so I'm not doing kernel hooking. And since I'm not doing kernel hooking, all these bypasses where you call a lower layer function or make a direct kernel call will work. So basically, if you are running binary code on a system, it is possible to bypass ambush. So why does this still matter? And this does still matter because there are a lot of instances where, first of all, it can't be bypassed. I might get argument from this from some people, but the basic idea of memory corruption exploits are starting to die. Memory corruption exploits are starting to go away, and we're starting to see a lot more emphasis. If you look at the exploits which are actually used in real attacks out there, we are slowly starting to see more and more exploits which are using things like logic errors, command injection, arbitrary file write. So for example, a few years ago, the great reliable Windows SMB exploit, MSO8067, used by Metasploit and everybody else to just remotely pop a Windows box, was a memory corruption exploit. Well, add in non-executable memory and ASLR, and Metasploit was never able to come up with an exploit for that which worked on Vista. And so exploit mitigations make those a lot more work and a lot harder. Not that they're not there, but they make it a lot work and a lot harder. So the SMB ODE that was discovered with Stuxnet, now all of a sudden they're not using a memory corruption exploit. They're using an arbitrary file write via a logic flaw, higher layer logic flaw. And all of these type of exploits can easily be prevented with ambush, because when I instruct SMB to, or I instruct in the case of the exploit from Stuxnet, when I instruct the print spooler to write to a particular file, it will follow the normal kernel 32 ntdll function call. I can't instruct the print spooler to make a raw syscall and bypass the Windows API. Other exploits which are becoming more common are things like Chrome privilege, JavaScript execution. Recent 0 days demonstrated in Google Chrome. There have also been 0 days in Firefox, which have been all implemented this type of exploitation. They will obtain JavaScript code execution with Chrome or full system privileges. And so once again, with that privileges, yes, you can write a file, you can execute a process, you can do whatever you want. But since you're using a higher level JavaScript abstracted API, you can't say make a direct syscall. It has to follow the normal Windows API function flow. So you can, with ambush, prevent whole classes of exploits such as command injection exploits and exploits such as the Chrome privilege exploit. And there are a lot of ways in which it can't be bypassed. There are also a lot of places in which it is very, very difficult to do a bypass. So for example, shellcode. Shellcode is, again, one of the focuses of ambush. Small bit of code used in a memory corruption exploit to pull down or pull in the rest of the backdoor and launch that. Normally speaking, there's limited space available, whether that's on the stack or on the heap, for shellcode. And so they try to make it as small as possible. Well, oftentimes you only have about 500 bytes or so in order to load up your shellcode. And so it uses raw syscalls. As we'll see, I'll show you an example if we have time. We should have time. Of a bunch of different shellcode and how that works. Well, that will use high-level function calls like the Windows sockets call. There is a lot of work that goes on in user mode in order to open up a socket, in order to make a network connection, or in order to download a file, or in order to execute a process, all of which happens in user mode, and all of which one of these shellcode pieces is going to have to do. And so, for example, some shellcode, a lot of shellcode, uses something called URL download to file A. It's a high-level function, which will then, it's the simplest function to go out, download something from the internet, save it to a file all in one shot. So it's very popular among shellcode writers. However, this function is not used by things like Internet Explorer or Firefox. They all want to maintain control of caching and connections, et cetera. So they're not going to call this one function which does everything for them. They're going to go have control over all those, do it from a lower layer. So if you see this function called at a high level, that's another thing Ambush excels at. You can say if this happens at a high level, even if the low level result, network traffic, downloading a file is the same, I know that this is probably something bad. And so other host intrusion prevention systems, network intrusion prevention systems, they'll only see that a download happened. And you can't generically stop all downloads, but you could generically stop all URL download to file A's. And that would stop probably nothing legitimate and lots of malware. And bypassing these is not going to be easy, because let's say I'm a malware writer. I say, OK, URL download to file A might be hooked if somebody has ambush. Well, I'm going to skip the first few bytes of the function, recreate those, and just jump to the middle of the function. So if there is a hook on this function, I've bypassed it. Well, now with ambush, what I can do is I can write a signature for the win inet functions. So inside URL download to file A, it calls different functions. Open internet, make a connection to a remote server, start reading a file from a remote server, open a URL. All those functions, I can put a signature and say, if that function is being called from urlmon.dll, which is the DLL which URL download to file A is called, then I know that they're using this function. Even if they didn't hit my hook on that function, by looking through the call chain back up, I can say, oh, they're coming from this point. And I can still write a signature to kill the calling thread or process and break the shellcode. So this, like I said, you can do, based on that one function call, probably about 20 or 30 different possible ambush signatures to catch that. And it will be very, very difficult for an attacker to use Windows code and not risk hitting one of those functions. So it is very difficult to bypass this unless you completely re-implement everything. And like I said, shellcode has to be small. So to re-implement network libraries takes an incredible amount of space. You're talking half a megabyte at least. Not to mention, I'm not aware of anybody actually doing that on Windows. So you'd have to reverse engineer it, and it's probably different between all the different versions of Windows. At the very least, all the syscalls are different between all the different versions of Windows. So this is not going to be very easy. And finally, I'm going to take a little bit of time, not too much time since we're starting to run low, and talk about strategy. When you're doing defense, you have to, even if it isn't foolproof, you have to take the best strategy. So there are different strategies which have been proposed. And one of them, I get a kick out of exploit developer world. Even though I've been one, I've played in it a little bit, I still get a kick out of a lot of exploit developers. So a lot of the real famous hackers, if hackers are famous, are exploit developers. And what's kind of funny is, even though as much as you're like a total expert on one exact area of computer security, oftentimes you don't get the bigger picture. So some suggestions which have been put forward from some of the offensive community is, well, you should have secure software. So basically either don't write software with bugs or don't use software with bugs. And I mean, I'm all for increasing the security of software. For example, if software developers just buckled down and used Java or .NET or any other memory-safe language, then we won't have any of the memory corruption vulnerabilities to start with. But it is not a winning strategy to assume that you can eliminate all vulnerabilities, to assume that you can not use software with vulnerabilities, because they're going to be there. And even if they're not there, a lot of the pen testers I talk to, who are some of the best pen testers, don't even use exploits at all. They just simply send somebody something to click on, they allow the signed applet or the macro or whatever, and they've got access. And it's just more work than it's even worth to try to put together an exploit. So no bugs is not really a good strategy. There's also another strategy here which I get a kick out of. And so this one is, I call blame the user. So if you can't see this, this is a screenshot that I pulled from Twitter where Dan Kaminsky basically says, is antivirus even worth anything? And then Mikko, who's in charge of an antivirus company, goes, yeah, we just stopped 500 people from getting infected with this thing. To which attrition, I don't know if whoever wrote this is here, hi. I thought this was kind of funny. He says, oh, well, it sounds like those 452 people shouldn't be allowed to use a computer. So I mean, regardless of, so that's kind of funny. Maybe that is the case, but maybe they were just browsing any random site, and that site had a malicious advertisement or whatever, which pulled back to an exploit pack, which had a Java exploit, which still hasn't been patched by Oracle, and the user didn't really do anything which should have gotten them owned, and they got owned anyway. So blame the user. Well, right. While that may make you feel better inside, it's not going to work. So what else can we do? Well, we do have one example of successful defense. I think it's also kind of funny how exploit developers, on the attack side, people are very, very protective if they've got a good exploit. So they are not going to share that out. They're not, sell it for maybe a lot of money, but they are not going to let other people know about their secret sauce. I think it's kind of funny that it's almost the same way in defense. People who have put up a successful defense often either don't want to tell you about it, or people are on defense and they don't know they've been owned, or they just have no clue in general. And when you go to I was a little nervous about even speaking on strategy in the first place, because you go to a talk on strategy and chances are you're either going to get like a guy up here in the C-suite who has like 6 points and they all start with the same letter and he's just talking about vague generalities and you don't really get anything from the talk. Or you have something which is super specific and you also don't get anything from the talk either. Well, there is an example of successful defense. The link will be on there from the guys at Lockheed, who are probably the best example, who will actually tell you about what they did, actually faced significant adversaries and actually stopped them, and also blew a bunch of O-days, caught a bunch of O-days that they were using to get in. So it's kind of funny. You talk with attackers that, well, we used an O-day. You can't catch us. Whereas in reality, in order to have a successful defense, what they did is using open source info, basic security, somehow threat research, somehow you identify an attack which the attacking group, whoever is targeting you, trying to get in, uses, and you figure out what their command control servers are, you figure out what their exploits are, you figure out how they gain access, how they call back, how they send their emails, how they persist on the system, how their malware works, how every single part of this attack works. They had 7 different characteristics which they watched in this paper that I linked to. And then you block them, and you monitor every single one of those points so that the next time that they try to get in, they may change up their malware, they may change up their exploit, they may change up their phish, but they forgot and used one of the same IP addresses which they had before. And now you catch them again, and you figure out all their new exploit, their new malware, their new backdoor. And every time they keep trying to get in, since you know so much about their modus operandi, and it is so incredibly difficult to change up your modus operandi and change everything to do with it, most attackers cannot do this, that you stop them, and every time they try to get back in, they're just giving you more of their infrastructure, more of their exploits, more of their tools to burn. And it's actually quite satisfying and enjoying from a defensive perspective. So having said all that, I'm almost running out of time here, so I don't want to talk too much about commercial HIPSs, but they also all use inline API hooks, and they work. All right, let's do a demo. So I do have a demo video, but real men do it live. So I'm going to pray to the demo gods. All right, so this is the ambush screen. I'm going to go ahead. Actually, I'm going to pull this out of. I'm going to go ahead and log in here. You log into Ambush. Ambush is implemented as a server client thing. The idea is I wanted Ambush to be in a spot, in a position, when I released it, which is now, where you can set up a server, you can set up your signatures on this server. I'm going to go to my demo set in just a second. And you can push out an MSI to everybody on your network, which will then report back to your central server for alerts, for signatures, et cetera. So this should be deployable now in an enterprise. If you want to do it, you can also do it on your local host. But one of the interesting things with this is, in contrast with stuff I've done before, I think this could really be useful to everybody here who works at a company and everybody here who has a significant network. And I would really like to see this used. And I would really like, nobody's using this currently on a wide scale. If you're interested in this at all, definitely get in touch with me afterwards, because I definitely want to see if we can make this work. It's open source, it's free. I will help you with any bugs or anything else you encounter. But having said that, first let's go pull up. So when you launch a Metasploit exploit, I don't know if anybody here has ever looked at the shellcode, but it's going to execute, first of all, this big bunch of assembly. So this is the reverse TCP assembly source to the Metasploit interpreter stager. So the first thing that it does is it calls load library A of WinSock 232. And it goes on and makes a bunch of other function calls. So one of the things you can do is you can say, well, this is going to be called from memory, which is executable, and it also had to be written by the exploits. This will be page execute read write, which is unusual and not handled by most systems. So I'm going to go to my demo set here. And so I've created a signature along with some other signatures. But I've created a signature here. Basically, you go ahead, put in your name for the signature, tell whether you want to block it, kill a calling thread or process. I'm just going to do an alert so I can show you how many times we would catch this. And then you go ahead and choose your function. So I'm going to go to winsock232, pull up that function. That's going to load up the functions which that DLL exports. So I'm going to, oh, sorry, I'm not doing the winsock one. I'm doing the kernel 32 one. This is not easy to see. So I'm going to pull up kernel 32. And then I'm going to pull up load library A. So then it's going to load up the function prototype for that function. And then allow me to put in signatures for the argument. So I can go ahead and put in a regular expression. I can say if I see load library A called and it's only calling ws2_32, which is unusual. Most legitimate programs will use ws232.dll. So I can put in a signature for that, or I can put in a signature for a return value. If the return value points to memory with a protection of page execute read write, I've just hard-coded that to 40, but you can actually type in the symbol if you want, then go ahead and throw me an alert. So it's really easy to put together a signature like this. I just hit submit. I've already created that. The signature is right here. And then it's good in the signature block. So I'm going to go. Yes. Yeah, you can. So if I did an import from the Windows API, you can define a custom DLL and a custom function, define what the arguments look like, and you can do any function you want. It just has to be standard API on 32-bit. Yes. All those functions which are there.
So you don't have to go in there and add them all.
No. All those functions which are there are good. They're in. All right, so let me close out some of this stuff. So I have over here my innocent victim, and I'm just going to go ahead. Oh, that didn't work. And make sure my signatures are updated. Signatures will propagate like every few hours. Here you go. Thank you. All right, so that just makes sure I have the latest copy of the signatures in case I modified them since I saved this VM. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a good PDF. Sure enough, everything works just handy dandy. And it is neato. All right, all is well. Now I'm going to open up this wonderful PDF that a guy named Script Junkie sent me in the email. And that is going to fire up. Oh, it's not on screen. This. And sure enough, oh, hey, look at this. I got a shell. So I got an interpreter shell on this box. And what's going to happen is it will have loaded up the shell code. Then it will have loaded up interpreter, which also does similar DLL loads. That will get reported centrally. It will wait about 30 seconds to aggregate calls, and then boom. Let me go ahead and pull this up to full screen. As we can see here, way down at the bottom, here's the load library A with WS232. Here's the shellcode function which we monitored. You will notice that none of these signatures fired in normal Acrobat operation. When I looked at the safe PDF, nothing happened, only when the exploit fired. Other things here, you can find it. So I put in different signatures looking for if WinSock receives into execute read-write memory. Those signatures fired. All these load library signatures. Let's try something else here. The thing to keep in mind is at any point, I could have put the signature to a block and the entire exploit would have failed. So now I'm going to do something else, which is very common among malware, and that is do some process injection, which I'm going to run migrate, spawn off a new process, inject into that process, and then kill the existing process. And so I have, let me think here. All right. And in just a second, that will fire up. So I put together a couple of signatures on the process injection functions, which Meterpreter uses. And then what you'll find is the reflective loader also loads up other functions, as you see here, as Meterpreter loads all this stuff. And sure enough, boom, here's all your load libraries. As you can see here, we use a virtual alloc EX into the remote process, write process memory, which is what Meterpreter uses to inject code into the other process, and then create remote thread to start that code. And then sure enough, here's the new process, and here is it loading up all the same Meterpreter functions which our existing process started from. Another thing that you'll notice here is that the calling module, this would have a calling module like which DLL or executable actually made the function inside the process. That is all blank because none of these calls came from a real module. They all came from the heap or the stack or somewhere. So all that's pretty cool. I will say I don't have time to do the demo, but the same signature will also light up or kill, in addition to any Metasploit stager, it will also kill Canvas. It will also kill Poison Ivy. I think it will also kill Core, but I haven't had a chance to try that. And so it's very easy for me, looking at shellcode, to put a signature together like this in a minute, which will then permanently kill it. It doesn't matter how they've encoded it, what exploit they've embedded it with. It doesn't matter how they've put it into an executable or how they distributed it, PDF, anything. System-wide, any attack, it's killed permanently. And so this is the type of activity which I have Ambush for. Thanks. And I think that's almost it. Let me go back over here. And all right, so everything is at ambush.ips.com. I would show it to you, but my wireless, I don't think my wireless is working very well. Yeah, that's not going to come up. But go to ambush.ips.com, and that concludes the talk. So, any questions? Go ahead. Right. Right. So at this point, I don't maintain state. I've been trying to think of a good way to do that in a generic fashion. I will say, however, when you do make a new signature, you can either blacklist and or whitelist both processes and calling modules. So if you have a certain process which makes a function call, you can blacklist that process, or you can blacklist the actual calling module inside that process. So if anything else happens, like somebody ends up executing code from the heap, as we showed here, then that will still fire the signature. All right. I think that'll be it. If you have any other questions, come talk to me afterwards.